Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division at Rochester Public Library. Welcome to today's presentation of Rochester's rich history, from Almshouse to Psychiatric Center, mental health care in Rochester. Welcome to all of you who are viewing from home. If anyone needs the restrooms, they are down the hallway, the far end, just past the lobby on the right. Please join us on Saturday, January 15th for our next presentation of Rochester's rich history as journalist and author James Thibodeaux presents Unearthing a Life, on the life and legacy of author, advocacy journalist, disability rights advocate, and Mouth magazine founder Lucy Gwynn, staying on a healthcare theme. Today's presentation. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed dramatic shifts in psychiatric care in the United States. These transitions played out locally in the Monroe County Almshouse, the Monroe County Insane Asylum, the Rochester State Hospital, and now the Rochester Psychiatric Center. Today we will explore these transitions with Laurence B. Guttmacher, MD, and Robert Riley, MPH. Dr. Guttmacher is an emeritus professor of psychiatry and medical humanities at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and former chair of the George Washington Corner Society for the History of Medicine. At various times, he has directed resident and medical student education in psychiatry, been an associate dean of the medical school, and was, for many years, the clinical director of the Rochester Psychiatric Center. Mr. Riley is assistant to the executive director of the Rochester Psychiatric Center, where he's been responsible for the historical records of the Rochester Psychiatric Center and its predecessor, the Rochester State Hospital, for more than 30 years. He is an adjunct instructor in medical humanities and bioethics at the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry. Without further ado, Dr. Guttmacher and Mr. Riley.
Hopefully this is working. You can hear me? So I'm just curious about the audience. First of all, delighted to see all of you here. How many of you, one way or another, were connected with the state hospital? Fantastic. Good. So, catch me up in any overt lies. So you heard in the introduction, and I'll tell you in a minute where all this came from, and there are other people here who deserve a lot of credit for this. So this is indeed what was the workhouse sitting over on this end, the county infirmary, and the county insane asylum. And I'm going to be using some strange language that I will explain that by modern ears, I'm going to offend a lot of people, but I'm going to be using the terms that were used. So, as soon as I figure out how this works, or super somehow. That's so strange.
It's okay now.
Okay.
Dr. G, you can take your mask down if you'd like.
That will probably be helpful. So, just where this talk came from. In front here is Bill Danza. Bill and Bob really started this, and I've stolen much of the talk from them. So anything that's good, they're responsible for. Anything that's really bad and crappy, that's my doing. Bob and I had a couple of medical students who each spent a summer working with us, going over RPC history. Jack Gordon and Peter Juviler, both who were very involved, they were lead authors on papers that will be appearing at some point shortly in Rochester History, the local journal that comes out of the library. And again, they were immensely helpful with all this. Let's give this another try.
There it goes. It's okay. It's just taking a little time for some reason.
All right. So just to give us some orientation and some dates. We start out with the Almshouse, the poorhouse, which opens in 1824. And it combined several populations. Part of why I love this is that the whole history of American institutional psychiatry is so absolutely mirrored in Rochester. What happened here happened in Massachusetts, happened around much of the country. And we've gone through all the same stages. This poorhouse opened with a theoretical census of 100 people, and within 3 years they were up to 35, and then the population starts to take off. In 1836, the state legislature opens the first, what we would now call state hospital, in Utica. If you get a chance to go there, the old original building is still there, utterly magnificent. Bob and I were lucky enough to get a tour of the place, and it is quite amazing. And then they authorize it, and then 7 years later, the lunatic asylum opens. And you're going to get used to this language. So let's talk about the language that was used. And as we go over each of these, think about the kind of implicit message, the baggage that's loaded up with these terms. So we start out with the almshouse, and this combines what really was a jail, we'll talk more about this, a place for the mentally ill, and a place for those who were economically unproductive, for the poor. It's called initially, in 1857, we opened the Monroe County Insane Asylum. Doesn't asylum sound nice? A place that will take you away from the stress of the world. And this was a term that was used around much of the country. The Hartford Asylum, so those, the Brattleboro Asylum are still around with those terms. And as we'll talk about, this was part of the picture of how do you most effectively treat the mentally ill. You remove them from the stress of the city, you put them out in the country, you give them structure, you give them a place where they can recover. And it's no accident that this opened up. That original picture was on what is now the corner of South and Elmwood. And it's no coincidence that it opened up there, well removed, 3 miles away from what was then the city of Rochester. That is then followed in many places by retreat or sanitarium. Again, lovely terms. We never use that one. And then it is followed by hospital. So now we're starting to medicalize what's being offered. So the Rochester State Hospital opens in 1891. This then evolves into the Psychiatric Center, and I'm not even going to go over the horrible name that the University of Rochester now calls their mental health facility, but it's a behavioral health something or other.
Larry, can I throw something in just as
Please.
So the earlier picture was South Avenue, and for those from Rochester, that often became the pejorative term for inconvenient people. They often said that South Avenue, those institutions, so he mentioned the workhouse, which eventually evolved into the penitentiary, and then there was the poorhouse or the almshouse, and that eventually evolved into the Monroe County Home and Infirmary, which is now Monroe Community Hospital. And then we're talking and focusing more on the Rochester State Hospital, Rochester Psych Center. But the term a convenient place for inconvenient people and the stigma that was attached to South Avenue. I grew up here and I used to hear people slur others by saying, "You belong on South Avenue." Or if you were a harried parent telling your kids, "You're going to put me on South Avenue." That was a whole other story. But it's just curious how communities were required. It was a colonial model that the counties ran institutions to take care of problems or needs for that. And I think that's the context to kind of look at this. So our evolution of our hospital you know, it was the stigma. I keep saying that's a piece that often floats in mental health is how people get labeled. And so we focus on that. And as Larry said, that language was appropriate for the day. Today it still feels as I mean, we see it now and recognize it as inappropriate for discussion. But Larry, go ahead. I don't mean to.
No, great. Let's also talk more in terms of language. What do we call the people who we would now come up with a more modern term for? And we've gone through evolutions. There were lunatics, that became madmen, that became the insane. And if they were in these institutions, they were often referred to as inmates. Think about, again, the baggage with that. Eventually, patients were recently consumers, or people with lived experiences. We're trying to get away from these stigmatizing sorts of words. We've also had interesting language for the people who would work with these folks. So originally I would have been a mad doctor. Some people call me that, but it's different. I would have later been an asylum doctor. Maybe I would have risen up to become an asylum superintendent. My father was also a psychiatrist, and when he first worked, circa 1920, he was an alienist. Again, think of the baggage with that term. He's taking care of the alien. And then finally, psychiatrist evolves significantly later, and it comes from Psyche, the goddess of the soul. I like that better. So, going over the origin of this. So in 1824, the superintendent was to require and compel all persons committed to his care or custody to perform such work, labor, and service towards defraying the expense of their maintenance and support. So no free supper here. If they were to refuse, they were to keep each and every disobedient person in solitary confinement in some part of the same house and feed him, her, or them with bread and water only. So picture being quite psychotic in the hospital, perhaps unable, if you're actively hallucinating, you're maybe not going to be doing such a good job working on the farm or doing your tailoring. And what would happen? You're ending up on bread and water in your cell. And so, what were we doing successfully? We were taking the economically unprotected, the poor, the mad, and the criminal, and placing them in an institution, getting them away from the broader society, and clearly not offering much of anything in the way of meaningful care. Those of you who've been around Rochester a while will recall what happened in 1984 in Highland Park when a whole series of graves were found unmarked. I had seen varying estimates, certainly 300 is probably conservative, people who were buried there that were residents going back to the asylum district.
Not just on the streets.
Oh, what happened? You're missing a very bully picture.
When we were putting this together, we just kind of decided that if questions are coming up, if you can hang on to them, and as we get to the end, we have a nice sufficient amount of time, so we'll do our best unless.
But while we're waiting for the pictures to show up again, Ryan Thibodeaux is sitting here. Ryan is a professor of psychology at St. John Fisher and has been leading a, to me, very meaningful and wonderful project trying to honor the people who were there. Ryan, do you want to come up and take a minute and talk to us about what's going on?
I should add, his work is coupled with work done quite a few years ago when this began. Local folks did an original plan, so he'll describe that. This is sort of an addition, a continuation of recognizing the need to recognize individuals who have been forgotten.
All right, so as Dr. Guttmacher said, my name is Ryan Thibodeaux, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm on the psychology faculty at Fisher, just down the road a piece, and I have a great deal of interest in the history of mental illness, history of psychiatry, and especially the institutions that popped up, really in the 19th century in this country that in an attempt to care for people with what we now call mental illness, what was then called insanity, lunacy, a variety of other things. And so I do this thing wherever I travel, really, either whether near or far, I insist on going to the nearest abandoned poorhouse or poorhouse cemetery or asylum cemetery or whatever, and photographing, documenting my travels and photographing.
He also takes his children with him.
Indeed, I do. Yeah, they've been to more poorhouse cemeteries than most 8 and 10-year-olds have. And so I document all my travels on Instagram. I'm not sure if anyone's on Instagram, but it's Asylum Adventures. I think I have around 230 followers. So I'm not exactly a social media superstar, but maybe with your help, I'll become the next. I'll become the Kim Kardashian of asylum photography or something like that. But anyway, the project that Dr. Guttmacher referred to was, I think that there's a photograph coming up. There are a large number of folks who are buried in a cemetery in a public plot. These are folks who died in one of the 3 county institutions that were on, South Ave. So that's the Insane Asylum, which of course became the State Hospital, which became the Psychiatric Center. Also the workhouse/penitentiary and the Almshouse as well. And so what we're trying to do is, and they're at unmarked graves. It would be when you're in that section of the cemetery, it's very easy to think that you're in a vast open field actually. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to design and to erect what we hope will be an appropriate monument to, a tribute to the folks who are buried there. And so we're right in the middle of our work. There's been some wonderful involvement from a variety of folks in the community, including mental health professionals and mental health administrators and historians. And we had some very nice involvement from the Friends of Mount Hope and lots of others, academics like myself, others as well. So I guess I'll leave it at that, but if anybody after the presentation is done wants to talk more about this or has questions about this, I would love to hang around and chat with you about that. So
I think 30 seconds on the January event.
Yeah, okay, so the January event. So at Fisher, we're really, really excited. This is going to be in mid-January. If anybody's familiar with the story of the Willard suitcases, I won't describe it a great deal right now, but in a nutshell, Willard State Hospital was on the shore of Seneca Lake, about 60 miles southeast of here. When the place closed, hospital staff found a bunch of suitcases of former patients that were long forgotten, that dated back to the 19th century in some cases actually. And so there was this wonderful effort to retrieve the suitcases, and to quickly after that they went into the collection of the State Museum. But there was a photographer from Massachusetts. His name is John Crispin, and he actually has a website called WillardSuitcases.com, so you can go there and check out some of his work. But he really extensively photographed the collection actually, and really produced some really just fascinating and very moving images of the patients, their belongings. We're going to be at Fisher hosting an exhibit of his work at the art gallery on campus. It's also going to be accompanied by a symposium at which a number of diverse scholars, including Dr. Guttmacher, are going to show up and offer diverse perspectives on the cases in the institution and their lives. So artistic perspectives and historical perspectives and medical perspectives and humanities-based and social science perspectives and so on. So we think it's going to be a really great event. And so there again, I'd be more than happy to chat with you about that as well. And actually, it's open to the public, so you're more than welcome to attend in mid-January. So
Thank you, sir.
thank you.
So let me take a couple minutes and talk about Dorothy Dix, a absolutely remarkable figure, and one of the. She becomes sort of the Johnny Appleseed who runs around trying to do something about the really horrible conditions under which the mentally ill were cared for. There's this wonderful quote from one of her biographies. While other Victorian women, if they stepped outside the domestic circle at all, circulated petitions and formed benevolent associations that influenced the masculine system from which they were excluded, Dix invaded the system itself, grasped the levers of power of government, and exercised substantial power. So she grows up in rural Maine with a daughter of a minister and a family with considerable mental illness, and kind of flees the horrors of this upbringing and is raised by an aunt who was incredibly well connected in Boston from Cambridge, and knows the governor, and she has this connection. And she starts to lobby the legislature to do something about creating better care. And I'm quoting this memorial just because I find it so fantastic. In talking to the legislature, she said, "I come to present the strong claim of suffering humanity. I come to claim before the legislature of Massachusetts the condition of the miserable, the desolate, the outcast. I come as the advocate of the helpless, forgotten, insane, and idiotic, men and women, of being sunk to a condition from which the most unconcerned would start with real horror, of being wretched in prisons and more wretched in our almshouses. The pauper insane," and note this distinction because already we're getting private institutions for those with money. The pauper insane were confined in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Some may say these things cannot be remedied. These furious maniacs are not to be raised from their base conditions. I know they are. I could give you many examples. One such is a young woman who was for years a raging maniac, chained in a cage and whipped to control her acts and her words. She was helped by a husband and a wife who agreed to take her in their home, and slowly she recovered her senses. She talks about another whose fetters and manacles I caused to be removed, and whose aching, bruised limb I chafed and bathed. Looking hopefully at her, he said, now I was treated like a human creature. God is good. He sends you to set me free. I will pray for you forever." So, the eloquence with which she does this, how could any self-respecting state legislator not respond to this? And she runs around the country, even into Europe, and is responsible for opening a vast number of what become hospitals. She takes a fairly modern view, believing that mental illness is caused by something going on in the brain. And if you accept this idea that it's an illness, then the idea of chaining people or keeping them in cages, in cells, makes absolutely no sense. And she starts to carry the day. She does come to Rochester. She runs around the entire country looking, even worse than Ryan running around looking at graveyards. She's running around looking at every poorhouse that's there. And we did, relatively speaking, fairly well. So when she comes here in the 1840s, the Monroe County house at Rochester was well arranged and neatly kept, with the insane confined in decent cells of fair size. And we're still keeping them in cells. And each had a bed. Isn't that remarkable? So Finally, in 1863, we opened a separate asylum to care for the insane, breaking them out from this combination bad house, poorhouse jail. And it's run by the County Board of Supervisors. And there is now physical separation from the poorhouse. About the same time, just 4 years later, the Board of State Commissioners of Public Charities is established, and they are required to inspect all publicly funded charitable and custodial institutions. So now suddenly we've got Albany coming in to look at the care that's being provided here.
Larry, can I just throw in here?
Sure.
All of these developments are taking place within the context of the broader history of this country. And the period of time, the 1840s, 1850s. So if you look at just treatment of the mentally ill, there's waves of optimism and then desperation and more optimism. And this was one of the times where we were reaching some optimism. And this whole outflowing of interest in developing institutions to solve problems. Some call it the Jacksonian Period of American history, where it was the country was booming, it was growing, and they looked, and so the asylum became a tool. And there's a lot, and we could go way off path, but in terms of designing how it was laid out, how it went there, and it was just the general impulse of the government to say, we can solve things. So it was very, very optimistic, and as you follow, and we're not going to quite follow that same way, 100 years later, so we're talking about the 1850s, 1860s, 100 years later, we're in a period of very...
You're up for 1 sec, because we lost our picture again.
Okay. 100 years later, 1950s, 1960s, was a period of pessimism, of like, what are we going to do? There were 500, almost 600,000 public psychiatric beds that crowned the country. So I'm just saying, as you're listening to this, that kind of wave was out there. And it helps kind of put this into place. And social attitudes, followed that period of time. So one of the things we have to do is, they once said the essence of genius is knowing what to overlook. When we're assembling these, there's so many roads or paths you can go down. We have to kind of keep ourselves back a little bit anchored. But in terms of just general interest, that's an important piece to keep in mind.
What we also see with this institution is that, and we'll talk a little bit about why this was happening, the population just keeps expanding rapidly. And they're always playing catch up, trying to find enough room for the people to go there. So by 1872, they've had to expand, just a few years later. The patients were inmates at that point. And they had 181 inmates in a facility that only had 160 beds. They expanded up to 275. They're spending $21,000 a year in 1875 to maintain the place. And we have the inmates doing routine housework and farming. And we'll talk more about that, but this becomes a sort of consistent theme that those who can will contribute to the institution. In 1873, another wonderful term, the Office of the State Commissioner in Lunacy was created. He, and it was always a he, was responsible for licensing of all public and private institutions for the care of the mentally ill. So again, now we're getting the state starting to overlook. It's been a county-based system with the exception of these two hospitals, the one at Willard and the one in Utica. And the counties are now getting oversight because there clearly was considerable variation in the quality of care. This is a commitment paper from 1864. And frankly, it's the same system, very close to what is used today for involuntary commitment. This one was 1871. The superintendent of Monroe County Asylum was Dr. Ward, a wonderful name for such a superintendent. And this comes from the Office of the Overseer of the Poor, and it required 2 physicians, much as it requires today, who under oath would set forth the insanity of such persons. It shall include every species of insanity and extend to every deranged person and to all of unsound mind other than idiots. And once the person, these 2 physicians would certify this, a court would then review them and would be required to come up with approval or not within 5 days of the commitment. Again, not terribly dissimilar to the current system. As I alluded to, the numbers started to take off. If you look at the model that was in place, with the rarest of exceptions, Bethlehem or Bedlam in London, Salpêtrière in Paris, other than a very few of these institutions, they were all small, no more than 200 people, often much less. And that led to a very different model of care. So the superintendent of the hospital would often live in the same building with the patients, with his family. And they would serve as models of how you were supposed to behave. And it was small enough that the superintendent could see every patient every day. But all of a sudden these numbers are ballooning, and that kind of model is no longer possible. To give you some numbers, in 1994, we had 150,000 people who were in mental hospitals. That works out to 2 per 1,000 of the general population. By 1950, when we're approaching the peak, which will happen in another decade, we're up to 3.4 per 1,000. Today, the most recent figures I could find were 2014, we're down to 0.05 per 1,000 in terms of people in the hospital. So we have rapidly evolving models of care. And so the question now comes is, why did the numbers go up so much? And what was going on? One of my top 2 favorite historians of the history of psychiatry is Edward Shorter. And he talks in this wonderful quote that the rise of the asylum is the history of good intentions gone bad. These were well-intended people, but they sure involved in some pretty awful places. People, frankly, were getting warehoused. And so what had happened that was allowing for this? So clearly, everybody was overwhelmed. There's no question about this. The numbers had gotten completely out of hand. Second hypothesis, were we admitting people who shouldn't have been there? Was that contributing to the overcrowding? And then lastly, this use initially of what was called moral treatment, this idea of getting people removed from the city to give them the kind of proper model they should have, to treat them with respect, etc., was in some ways destigmatizing mental illness. And was that also making it more acceptable for families to send people in? Now, I'm going to get to in a minute other reasons why families were getting overwhelmed. So, some hypotheses and some contributors, and I think all these are probably true. At the same time this was happening, American society was urbanizing. If you look at what had happened in Rochester, the farms that were out in Mendon were now getting more and more people now living in the city. The mills have opened. Both members of the family are likely to now be working. You're not sitting out on the farm where crazy Aunt Mary could be kept in the house during the daytime. You're now living on top of one another. The stress has greatly increased. And could this be contributing? I'm sure it did. There's an interesting dramatic increase in neurosyphilis, which was almost unheard of prior to the late 18th century and does start to really take off. The consumption of alcohol increased dramatically. So alcohol becomes much cheaper. As beet sugar evolves, that becomes a cheap and ready source of alcohol. Americans drank 1.8 gallons of alcohol per person in 1845, which still sounds to me like a staggering figure, but apparently. And was up to 2.6 gallons in 1910. So alcohol clearly doesn't help all of us. Maybe we get much of it, for some of it, so that probably contributed. There are reasons to think that the prevalence of schizophrenia has actually increased as well. Nobody's got any good idea why. But if one goes back and looks at old records, it seems much less frequent than in more recent times. Clearly, healthcare is starting to get better. People are getting older, and that means you're probably going to start to see more senility showing up, and those folks again might be difficult to manage in urban homes and would end up in the hospital. And then we have waves of immigration. So picture what it's like, you know, you've been a farmer in Italy, you arrive, you don't speak English, you're tossed into this urban Rochester. You are facing an alien culture. You may well be very limited economically. So picture what that stress must have been like and what it's like now for many of similar strains. And it again would make sense that this might serve as fertile grounds for development of our mental illness. So I think, you know, my buy is that all of these things probably contributed and account for the increased numbers that we're seeing. I'm going to go off sideways for a minute because that's what I do. So my other favorite is Andrew Scull. And Andy had a recent book, and he talks about three distinct phases of American society, American psychiatry. In the first, in the asylum era, that lasts really towards the end of the First World War, beginning of the Second. You end up with the best and the brightest going into psychiatry among doctors, and they would work in hospitals, especially the private hospitals. It's much less true of the Rochester State Hospital, much more true of the McLeans of the world. But that's attracting academically accomplished, gifted people. During the second phase, we have now a number of European Jews who are trying to get out in time, many of them psychoanalytically trained. And as they move to this country, and as they are facing these hospitals that are no longer good places to work because the numbers are getting so bloody out of hand, and they're often going off into private practice. In 1954, if you were a state hospital doctor, you made $9,000 a year. The average for psychoanalyst was $22,000 a year. So we can tell who was valued at that point. If you looked at academic psychiatry, essentially every single department was chaired by somebody who was psychoanalytically trained. And then somewhere in the 1990s, we began to dethrone psychoanalysis, and biological psychiatry starts to take off. The wonderful paper, which was called On Mindlessness and Brainlessness in Psychiatry, and one of my critiques of my field is that we tend to go from one extreme to the other. You know, and I worry that of late we have become much too biologic and much too little attention to the importance of psychotherapy, and that we are best off when we're somewhere in the middle of that pendulum, when we're not so good at getting there. So, meanwhile, back in Rochester, this is why we're here. In 1865, Dr. Howard 1885, Dr. Howard becomes the superintendent of what was then the asylum. Howard is a fascinating figure, a larger than life, both physically and in other ways figure. There's this wonderful chair made for Dr. Howard by the patients in the hospital. It's this huge chair. I'm almost Dr. Howard's size. I look wonderful sitting in that chair. And when I was the clinical director, I flirted with bringing the chair into the office. It unfortunately has the arms resting on two naked women, and I thought that was probably not the thing to do. So it's there, but no longer used.
Can I just jump in for
Yeah.
a second?
We'll see a lot of pictures from this point on that were taken of over the last, this one on turn of the century, in 1917. So just that I think you know this, the corner of Elmwood and South Avenue is where it all happened. This building, and again, with the interesting thing with a lot of the information, it isn't clearly labeled, and you sort of put the pieces together. So you'll see quite a few photographs of interior buildings and that. But if you think of the El Siegel Center, that whole plot was essentially where this building would have been sitting. That corner, and you'll see this, I won't belabor it now, but the growth of the institution forced everything across Elmwood Avenue to the famous Elmwood and South Campus, which is where many of the buildings are now. And the high rise, of course, and you'll see that later on. That's a whole other story in itself. But just so you kind of can place this will be, from this point on, we'll be talking about that corner.
As you look at these pictures, there's a wonderful book called The Architecture of Madness. And the author talks about how similar many of these buildings looked to college dormitories of my era. She juxtaposes pictures from Smith College with state hospital buildings. And it really was pretty amazing. So, context again. In 1890, the State Care Act is passed. And Albany now takes control of all of the county asylums. And in 1891, then the Monroe County Asylum becomes the Rochester State Hospital. In 1891, we had 355 patients. By 1927, we're up over 2,000. So things are starting to really take off, and the question is where you're going to put them. So who were these patients? Well, I'm going to give you some more numbers. In 1880, 48% of the admissions were foreign-born. That contrasts with 29% of Monroe County being foreign-born. So clearly, disproportionately admitting immigrants. And I'm going to argue the consistent theme is who ends up in the hospital? It's society's most oppressed folks. The people who are most stigmatized and are having most trouble, and it's sad to say, I think believe still true today. Let's look at the impact of gender. So if we look at this, and this is a very busy slide, but if you look in the left column, we'll see the number of male patients, number of women patients, and take a look at the percentage of women admitted. And you'll see that all the way until more recently, women were overrepresented in the population in the hospital. Monroe County, of course, always was sort of 51% like the rest of the world, female. There were women doctors almost from the beginning of RPC, and that was basically because no woman should be taken care of by men. And so, in some ways, it was a lot better. The most recent data are down at the bottom. And what you'll see is we've actually reversed things. So that RPC now has two sides. There's a civil side of the hospital, an ordinary state hospital. And then New York State has 4 forensic units. These are people who have been charged with committing a felony. They are there for evaluation to see if they are competent to stand trial. And if they do stand trial and are successful in getting a not guilty by reason of mental defect plea and are found dangerously mentally ill, they will end up in the state hospital, where they may be there for restoration of competency so they can go to trial. So that, the forensic side, not surprisingly to me, is overwhelmingly male. And interestingly, the civil side now is down to 37% female. All right, Bob's pictures, and a lot of these are really posed. Okay, so this is the croquet match happening outside of the County Asylum in 1872. This is an early picture of the Monroe County Asylum, which is coming up in a second here. These are all on South Avenue, I believe, right? And this is the Monroe building, again, going back to the college dormitory thing. Now, this is where the administration was. Hence the nice curtains in the window. But pretty damn impressive, isn't it?
So that building stood at the corner until about 1966. It was demolished for the single center construction. This allegedly was a normal day on a normal mental ward. I doubt it. But it was inside where patients were. And, you know, pressed in ceiling, beautiful wooden floors, pretty nice pool table. I'm guessing the flowers were imported for the picture, but and then notice the two gentlemen looking like prison guards, wearing brass button coats. They're basically in uniform and I expect were attendants in that era. My first job in psychiatry was as an aide in 1963, and I too was uniform. It was all white in those days, but would no longer be the case. Back to Dr. Howard. Dr. Howard was in charge of the hospital for an incredibly long time, 42 years, until he finally died in an auto crash. He was responsible for an awful lot of good things, given the era. He opens the School of Nursing, which we'll see some pictures of, I believe, coming up. He manages this expansion. If you look at his papers, it's full of, I was a control freak. I mean, every single detail of every purchase is coming through his office. He must have spent an enormous amount of time, lots of correspondence with family members of patients. Amazing stuff. That's the School of Nursing from 1896. And 3 men. What's striking is the discrepancy in wages. So a nurse, if he was a man, earned $28 to $33 a month. If she was a woman, it was $23 to $28. So attendance, if you were a man, $20 to $24 a month, a woman, $14 to $18. was not hidden. This was advertised. There was state civil service, and that's the pay rate as it went. Kind of phenomenal sense of history.
Yeah. I'm gonna skip over Adolf Meyer. Adolf Meyer, along with Dorothy Dix in my mind, are the two most important figures in the history of American psychiatry. Swiss-born, he was initially a pathologist, doing work looking at autopsy brains of psychiatric patients. He rapidly sort of moves up the ladder, ends up in Worcester, and then is brought to New York in 1901. One of the things, Bob and I spent altogether too much time down in the basement at RPC, or I did. I realized how bad it was one New Year's Eve when I realized it was 10 o'clock and I'm down there reading charts from 1920. We start with individual case records in 1903 because of Meyer. Prior to that, you had doctors' rounding logs, but no single patient would have a chart where you could evolve to watch the history of the illness. Meyer pushes for what he called anamnesis, a thorough history, trying to understand the broad strokes of the patient and what got them there. He pays attention to psychobiology. George Engel, who some of you will know of, the Rochester doc, who coined the term biopsychosocial model, was a student of Meyer's at Hopkins. Meyer was doing biopsychosocial, he just didn't have the same name for it. So his influence on New York State, when he takes over the New York State system before finally moving to Hopkins, was huge. Let's skip this. And hopefully this will catch up with me shortly. So I want to talk for a minute about one of the things that Dr. Howard did, or Dr. Lamore, who was working for Howard, opened a lakeshore farm colony in Webster, a building that those of you from Webster will recognize.
It's part of the county park now. And wedding receptions, retirements are held in that building. Again, it's been changed, but that's one of the early frontier or early Webster pioneer home. Lake Ontario would be off the trees to the right. It sits on a bluff. The house is still there. And the state hospital leased land until into the 1950s to create what Larry's going to describe now.
So what they talked about was getting this lakeside place, again, peaceful, bucolic, lovely, and taking groups of patients, controlled groups of patients, to spend short periods with the idea that this would itself be therapeutic. This is maintained for a number of years. He does other interesting things. He opens a school for people with dementia precox, the term that was then used for schizophrenia. He brings in social service folks, social workers basically, to work with patients, paroled, again, a loaded term, patients who have been discharged but are being maintained on an outpatient basis. So some reasonably innovative things. These are people from the dementia precox school, and an attempt was made to teach the patients to be neat about their appearance. And it was surprising how much better they behaved when dressed in a neat and becoming manner. So how much better you're going to behave if you're treated with respect and kindness, which is basically, I think, what happened out there. This is the medical staff with the men in the front and the women in back. And I don't know, we ever decided the little girl, I believe, is the daughter of the business manager, we think. But you see here, this is 1918, and again, the need for women doctors. So this was a good place for women medical school graduates Go ahead.
In all of this, when you're thinking of it, the history of medicine itself parallels this. Where were we in 1918? Of course, a major pandemic was underway in those years, but it's a separate study. It's not something we can do, but it's fascinating. The jobs at a state hospital were sought after. It was predictable income. It was clearly hard work. And at that point, that was still a position that you would seek out. Because medicine was nowhere near where it is today. There was no health insurance of sorts. So a rural doctor would not have a steady, predictable income. They loved the work, but so state hospital work was
So state hospital work was not as negative as it evolved into the century, and we'll get to some parts of that.
So, again. This next slide has nothing to do with anything, it's just entertaining. So we're going to talk about patients' dances. So the important thing is these became total institutions. Okay? It's separate from the world. I'll show you pictures. There's a working farm that goes all the way down to Westfall from Elm. Who's working that farm? It's the patients with supervision from staff. There is a shop where patients' clothing is being made. There is a wood shop where the furniture is made. It's a total institution. And we'll show you some features of this. This are the rules for patient dances and what the staff were supposed to do. I'll give you a minute to read that. But attendants shall not dance with each other except in those dances specified beforehand. The male attendants to dance with female patients and female nurses with male patients. All male attendants not on other duty shall remain after the dance and assist in putting the dining room in order. Male attendants and patients must remain seated while the females leave the hall. These rules shall apply to all entertainments.
But I got to break in just for a second.
Men to stay seated, while the woman leave, woman doesn't.
That the superintendents shared ideas. So there's a network by this point of state hospitals across New York State, from downstate up, 25 or something. But it was very interesting. It was very decentralized in one way, and in another way, there were authorities in Albany that would oversee. But there's correspondence that goes back and forth between 3 or 4 superintendents, Dr. Harder, talking about recreational activities for patients. What's the best one? They talked about dances. Certain dances didn't want to allow. It's kind of fascinating, but as Larry said, total institutions.
It's frozen. Oh, no, just really slow. So again, in keeping with this idea of total institution, this is a dressmaking class. This is where people's clothing emerged. I mentioned the farm that went down as far as Westfall Road. And this is the stable with the horses that were used on the farm throughout that era. This is a view of the road leading down to the farm. And it was an employee baseball team. So employees by and large either lived on the grounds or had a house on South Avenue near where the state hospital was. So this was a team in the city league. I have no idea how good they were, but now, so this is a view of the campus, an aerial view, or part of the campus. And this is around 1940. I'm going to sneak up and point out a few things if I can. So, this is South Avenue. That's Elmwood. That's up here is where Alsegal is now. some of these buildings are still up. So no longer belong to State Hospital, but still there. This is still up, but will be, hopefully, will be raised at some point coming up. The farm would have been down below. Where the modern high-rise is would be about here, or not modern high-rise, the modern hospital. And the high-rise that you all know would be over here. So you're getting a picture of how immense this place was. And this is the governor and Dewey coming to break ground for the medical surgical building. That's the high rise, which the day it was opened should have been. We'll go over that in a minute. If you are interested in this, Bob and I and a couple of former patients and a couple of former staff got in and made a video that you can find on Vimeo called Echoes of the Past, which was this very odd thing of going back inside now to see what was left of the high rise, and then have a lot of memories of what the place was like. It closes in 1987. No, 95. Well, yeah, 95. And it was a horrible mistake the day it opened. And I'll show you why in a minute. So if you look at the census of RPC, look what happens. 1907, we're at 1282. 1954, it's up in excess of 5,000 patients. It falls slightly by 57 and falls a lot by 67. And today, it's 78. So what happened? A number of things happened. First, in 1954, the first antipsychotic came along. In 1956, the first effective antidepressant. And those helped, but not as much as the arrival of Medicare and Medicaid in 1963. The RPC of that era was overwhelmingly old in terms of the patients. And with the arrival of Medicare and Medicaid, the feds would pick up half the cost if you got people out of the hospital and into nursing homes. So now there is a huge inducement to start to move people out. So those things combined, along with a lot of pressure from the outside world, led to an initial horrible period of let's throw people out in the streets. Followed more recently, I've got to take my hat off, by a period where we're getting outpatient services to folks nobody wants to be, or not nobody, almost nobody wants to be at RPC as a patient. And people want to live in the community like you and I want to live in the community. And so we are developing better models to support people in order to help them get out there. We still got lots of homeless people, many of them with mental illness, who are not getting the care they need. We had them before, it's still there, and in some places, my wife and I were recently in Portland, and it's unbelievable. California, unbelievable. So, anyway, I would argue progress. So, what happened? Well, we got biologic treatments that worked. Some of them initially that were used didn't work, but were used anyway. I mentioned that there was a lot of syphilis. And the induction of malaria, causing patients to have high fever, was somewhat effective in killing the bacteria that causes syphilis. So that was used, heavy metals were used for that. And then finally, the arrival of penicillin obviously had huge impact in terms of turning neurosyphilis around. Phlebotomy was used about 300 times in RPC. This is not one of our better chapters. There's an interesting paper where directors of state hospitals get together and they talk about the enormous pressure they're feeling from families that are pushing hard for this. Cover of Life magazine is covered with the wonders of phlebotomy and how it is turning people's lives around. So there is this enormous pressure. And wham, bam, 1955, the minute antipsychotics arrive, it just falls off the face of the earth. ECT arrives in 1938. It is certainly done at RPC for a long period and is still an incredibly effective treatment for the right kind of depression. If I become psychotically depressed, do not pass go, take me straight to ECT. So that is still around and very effective. Insulin coma was used, another not very proud chapter, and so it was used at RPC as well. I have less idea of the numbers of that. And then the arrival of antipsychotics in 54 and antidepressants, and then finally lithium in 71. Since then, we really have nothing that's much better. So the last 50 years have been tinkering, but not anything that's a dramatic breakthrough. And then, as I mentioned, the Community Mental Health Center Act, Medicare and Medicaid really did it. In 1940, 60% of RPC's patients were 60 or older. So it was an old age home. These are the top 10 admitting diagnoses from RPC in 1907, 1957, and then last year. And there are a couple of favorites. 1907, leading diagnosis was unascertained, so at least it was humility. Heredity, intemperance, and you see the numbers falling from there. The 1957 dementia precox or schizophrenia, which is still far and away the lead now, comes along. Number 8, I love without mental disorder. I'm not quite sure why we're there. Anyway, and you see the diagnoses today. This is the new building, which I've got to say is probably the nicest, architecturally the nicest hospital building I've ever worked in. What fascinated me, at that point I was as strong when it first opened, and I would come over fairly frequently for consults. And the day it opened, the staff acted better and the patients acted better. And I'm convinced you put people in an environment where they feel respected and valued, and they'll do that. That horrible old high-rise, long echoing corridors, and 20 or 30 people sleeping in the same room, and no place for quiet or privacy, was not the kind of place that could make people feel respected or valued. The new building, I think, does a much better job of it. Now, I have been going on at great length, and I know there are a lot of people here with experience, and I would love to hear your thoughts, reactions, corrections, and what do you think? Oh, I'm supposed to stay on camera.
You're okay.
Yes?
Very simple question. Almshouse. Where did that term come from? What is an alms?
Alms were the money you gave to the poor, I believe, right? Yeah. And so this was a house where you took care of the poor.
I should point out, in the Rochester History Journal, and you can get to it online through the library website, there's some well-researched work done over the years. One of them is Poverty in Rochester, and talks significantly about answering those questions in that. So I want to give our local history as a wealth of information, because all of these, we're scratching the surface and trying to assemble one particular piece, but all of the others are worthy of some research in that. So yeah, thanks. And his almshouse was not an uncommon term. And I think even Dickens, you go back into, we inherited the how do you help someone who's poor? the model from England. So that goes back to the 1600s, Elizabethan poor laws and all the rest. And I'll stop going off into this, but you look and there are two categories, the worthy poor and the unworthy poor. And it's a kind of a fascinating, but it is true, and that image hangs into today. There is a certain, so giving public tax money to somebody who's poor is basically, they better be deserving. So who'd be deserving? It'd be a widow with children and others, but the guy who just got laid off because the canal closed for the winter and doesn't have jobs, those folks would come to the poorhouse and be treated without a lot of extravagance, because the idea of the poorhouse, the almshouse, was don't make it real comfortable, because you want people to go back and be productive. So I'll be quiet.
It does echo certain current political issues. Yes?
I was wondering if you could address what happened to older people. My grandmother was, she was sent to the state hospital in 1963, and I was 8, and I remember that it was kind of the end for us, kids, because it was sort of like grandma's, actually I believe it was the Walters building.
Yeah.
And, but she lived for 4 years and then she died, and the next time we saw her was in her casket. And I've been just so curious over the years about that 4-year period, and I guess I've wondered why she was sent there, first of all, for dementia, what the thinking was about old people, but also whether there's any place in the archives where I could at least find out what she did or whether she was treated or whatever,
Bob cannot answer this as a New York State employee. As no longer a New York State employee. Let me answer the archives question first. Yeah, it would be a place, but you can't. So what New York State has an interesting interpretation of HIPAA, which says that patient's privacy extends to the grave. And the rest of the world says HIPAA expires in 50 years, much of the rest of the world. So when I was clinical director, I would get requests like yours with regularity. And what I would have to say is I cannot give you access to your relative's record. I would be delighted to talk to you about what I know about what life would have been like in the Walters building in the 60s. If you can come up with a letter from a physician indicating that you were concerned about a hereditary disorder that your grandmother might have had, then I might be able to share some information with you. But that was about the only thing we could do. And my own strong bias is just wrong. And that there's so many people trying to understand your story of what happened to Grandma. And I think what happened to Grandma is that there weren't a lot of good alternatives around for people with dementia whose family couldn't care for them in the home. Nursing homes were fewer and were reserved for people with money. Yeah. I don't know, do you want to talk about the Walters building?
Well, I didn't start there until 1979, so I didn't start RTC until 1979, and when I got there, I was assigned to the Walters building, and that was the largest unit in the hospital at that time. We had 3 floors of 2 wards each, and completely filled the entire time we were there. And as Dr. Guttmacher alluded to, that was a time when we were transitioning into transferring patients. So we did a lot of work to move patients into nursing homes, and we would tour nursing homes and try to arrange for a safe and medically and psychiatrically appropriate living arrangement. But most of the patients there were a little older than I am now, so, and I'm 76. So, several patients that were in their hundreds. The one case that struck me was the woman who had been admitted 2 days after my father had been born in 1909. So that was eye-opening to me as to the long-term nature of not only the illness, but the care that they were receiving. I don't know if that gives you much of a picture of what it was like, but.
Thanks, Bill. All right.
Just as a follow-up to both of those, really. So you said that Medicare and Medicaid were huge, and because they offered federal subsidies to get people out of state hospitals and into nursing homes. So one thing that I've always wondered is, like, so did that pressure a growth in nursing homes then? So do we start to see at the end of the 50s or into the 60s like an explosion in the construction of nursing homes?
Yeah. So I realize I should be repeating questions for those virtual people. So the question was whether the arrival of Medicare and Medicaid and their funding for nursing home care led to an explosion of nursing homes in that era. And yeah, I think both new ones and ones getting much larger. I think it was about that point that St. John's greatly increased its size as an example. And so yes, this became now a viable and frankly much better alternative than what we had been doing. Yeah.
Where is the last slide, where is it located?
The current RPC?
Yeah.
Oh, so the question is, where's the current RPC? It's on Elmwood Avenue. It is somewhere between South and Goodman on the south side of Elmwood. So it's basically right next door to the old high-rise.
Right. And I'll just quickly fill in, the high-rise was closed in 1995, and the state of New York sold the building and the property about 5 years later to several local developers have owned it and passed it on. It's still owned by a local developer who had about 3 or 4 years ago, put a plan out to do something with it. But until that happens, it'll stand. It's been unused for 25 years. It's as Larry pointed out, we did if you remember, Echo of the Past. If you Google that, I'd say Google, you'll find it. Of course, you'll also find all kinds of pictures that portray the building as it sits now, as torn down. It's been stripped of all the metals. People have broken in and out of it. And I always have to point out, it was good intentions. In 1959, it opened. It was to house 1,000 patients. And they used the dormitory model, not private rooms. There may have been some private rooms, but the bulk were in large dormitories. Not uncommon for any building. Lots of controversy as to why you built a skyscraper. It was, I think, at the time, the second highest building in Rochester when it opened. You know, why would you build that? And that's a whole other story that goes off. Again, state of New York. If you look at post-World War II, by the 19th...
I'll tell the story if you will.
Larry will go through it. Yes, go ahead, Larry.
The story is incredibly simple. They had one set of architectural plans. And if you were going up in Manhattan, you couldn't spread out. Now, it made absolutely no sense at all in Rochester. Or, you know, I've been down to the State Hospital on Long Island, where again, there was plenty of room, and it's the same bloody building. Now, the building is 450,000 square feet, and it's brick, asbestos, brick. So the cost of bringing this thing down is staggering, which is why it's still up there. It comes with 20 acres of prime real estate, but, you know, it's been slow, to say the least.
Earlier, when you were talking about the construction of the high-rise, you referred to it as the medical surgical building. Was there ever a plan for it to be more general hospital, or just a term that was used?
No, I think it's actually interesting and reflective of the way care was done then. So you see, if any of you do look at this film that we did, up on the top is basically an operating room with surgical lights and the whole thing. And I mentioned the lobotomies, you know, they were done there. So you would have, for those, you had neurosurgeons from Strong who would come over and use the facilities there. the idea was to get as much care done in the hospital, I expect, also because it could be done more cheaply. So, yeah, it was med-surg. Yes, sir.
How young does someone have to be a patient?
How young?
Yeah, what's the minimum?
Oh, well, so there used to be a child unit. And I love that child unit. It was incredibly caring, well done, first-rate care. A decision was made to close it and to send the children from Rochester to West Seneca, south of Buffalo. What it used to mean was that families would come have dinner with their kids. Now, you have a lot of poor folks who end up in these hospitals, and now somehow they've got to get to West Seneca to see their children. It was a sad day when this decision was made. But how young? I do remember seeing an occasional 8-year-old, I think, there. I don't remember ever seeing anybody younger than that. Could it have happened? Maybe. Anybody know? Anybody younger? Obviously, mostly these were teenage kids, but as you do get this occasional onset, which is a horrible prognostic sign of schizophrenia very early in life, these are folks, as you might expect, who end up not doing well. Horrible for them and for their families. Yes?
We came today because we were mental health therapy aides, 1974 to 77. It was a real
Mahadas.
It was a real eye-opening experience for a suburban girl with a degree in French who was maybe thinking of getting into nursing or psychiatric nursing. They did pay for me to go to nursing school. And for the first few months, we lived in the nursing dorm, and it was $14 every 2 weeks after our paycheck for room and board. And I believe we worked in the high rise, and I believe there were 40 people in each dormitory.
Yeah.
And we passed meds like this with no training, a couple weeks, and off we went. We did everything.
Yeah, it's probably important not to forget the employees. Now, the interesting thing, public institutions provided a lot of employment, and that neighborhood from that, around that hospital, I heard a story that that they would do a noon whistle from the power plant, and that entire neighborhood would check their watches to make sure they were right for that. It just became a community. A lot of staff lived on the grounds, the nursing schools. They opened nursing schools to supply nurses. Now, by the time you're into the 60s, we're at peak capacity. I think if you remember that admission slide, peak capacity. A lot of work, not a lot of stigma, sadly enough. I mean, you were talking about families. That was often a chapter of family history that people wanted to basically not connect up with. So part of the reason the state has that reason to say we're going to basically not let any information out. And a lot of times families have a hard time with it. And so, again, that's another discussion. But I was saying, so a lot of staff had lived on the grounds. It was a way of attracting, keeping staff employed. But it was lots of employment.
And that was all kinds of stuff. I mean, ranging from the hospital director who had a big fancy house that just came down this past year, to staffing for psychiatrists that was considerably less fancy, but still individual houses, to the nursing dorms, and then all the other people who had their families living nearby. Yeah, my mother-in-law who went to nursing school at St. Mary's, did her psych rotation at the state hospital.
Another point is that a lot of staff brought their children into work, and so it was not being visible in some of the pictures. And over time, it would be like the family business. A cook would bring a son or a daughter, and they would work in the kitchen, or a nurse would bring in a son or a daughter, and they would follow the parents' footsteps into nursing school and nursing practice at the state hospital.
Oh, you still see multi-generation families
Yeah.
who continue to work there. Yeah.
I know we formally end at 2:30, but I don't know, Mary, I think I'd be happy to stay around afterwards if you want. But if there's other questions still, we've got a couple of minutes. I don't want to.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering if you knew when the peer movement or the consumer movement first started becoming a thing in Rochester.
Can't give you an exact date, but if you want the single thing that makes me most hopeful about the future, it's the whole arrival of the peer movement. So this is the idea of people in recovery. And think about it, I can talk to somebody about their hallucinations, but I've never experienced that. I don't know what it's like. To have somebody who has gone through that, who has gone through the, do I take my meds, do I not take my meds, who has gone through the whole stigma thing, and to have them, and who was making a recovery, to then be able to work with people who are currently suffering, it has enormous power. I think that it's basically over the last decade or so, that I don't have a precise date.
It was started, I think, in the 70s, because when I was in nursing school, I had to do an activity. I was in Rockport, I graduated in 79, and it was called peer-to-peer, I believe.
Okay,
And
yeah,
there
you're
were
right.
meetings in
Yep.
a church, and
Yep.
I attended one at that time, so I think it got started a little earlier.
So NAMI certainly was doing the peer-to-peer thing. Now, that's different, I think, from, so now New York State is hiring peers to work in the hospital, in the outpatient service, and it's become a recognized training and a recognized job title.
I just put in my certification application.
Go for it. No, that's great. Again, the power of this, I do a lot of teaching in the medical school, and one of the courses I teach is an elective, which I call psychiatric autobiography. So I have people read first-person accounts written by people in recovery. And I always teach it with somebody who's in recovery. And again, the students hear it from them so differently than they hear it from me. It's just enormously hopeful. My mentor was John Romano, the founding father of psychiatry in the University of Rochester. And John, even when he was still alive, was talking about this as his greatest hope for the future. We just need to continue to make use of this and figure out how to do it most effectively. And so I'm delighted you're doing that. That's great news. So we should probably stop. I think all of us would be delighted to stick around. Thank you guys so much for showing up. I was picturing
Thank you
more
very
suffering
much.
wife than me here alone.
Thank you very much.